Hi, I'm Pastor John from New Life Assembly, and we're continuing our daily devotionals through the Song of Solomon. Today we're talking about the conclusion to the storyline that has been going on since chapter 5 in the beginning, where the woman, Shulamith, decided that she was apathetic in love towards Solomon, and he came to her in a dream, and she told him that she wasn't really interested in his advances, and so he left. But at the time that he left, she was beginning to be ready for his advances, and it was too late. She finds herself hurt by the guards and asking the women of Jerusalem, the daughters of Jerusalem, to help her find Solomon. And then they ask her, well, what's so good about him? And so she tells them. She enumerates all of Solomon's wonderful attributes, and they remind her of his character and make her even more passionate about him. And so she finally goes to search for him in the gardens where he is checking on his crops. And so we look today at Song of Solomon chapter 6, verses 4 through 13. The man is speaking here as they meet in the garden, and he says, "You are beautiful as Tirzah, my love, lovely as Jerusalem, awesome as an army with banners. Turn away your eyes from me, for they overwhelm me. Your hair is like a flock of goats, leaping down the slopes of Gilead. Your teeth are like a flock of ewes that have come up from the washing. All of them bear twins, not one among them has lost its young. Your cheeks are like halves of a pomegranate behind your veil. There are 60 queens and 80 concubines and virgins without number. My dove, my perfect one, is the only one of her mother, pure to her who bore her. The young women saw her and called her blessed, the queens and concubines also, and they praised her. Who is this who looks down like the dawn, beautiful as the moon, bright as the sun, awesome as an army with banners?" Then Shulamith responds to Solomon and says, "I went down to the nut orchard to look at the blossoms of the valley, to see whether the vines had budded, whether the pomegranates were in bloom. Before I was aware, my desire set me among the chariots of my kinsman, a prince." The others now speak, and they say, "Return, return, O Shulamite! Return, return, that we may look upon you." And then Solomon speaks once again. He says, "Why should you look upon the Shulamite as upon a dance before two armies?" As we look at the text today, just a fair introduction, I am actually going to be changing a little bit of what our translation has enumerated for us and has explained to us as into who is speaking and what they're saying and all of that. The reason I'm going to do this is because this section of the Song of Solomon is the hardest section to translate and to interpret. There are some Hebrew idioms in here, Hebrew words. We just don't really know what they mean. And while we can take guesses, the fact of the matter is some of it is left up to interpretation. And some interpretations are better than others. And I'm not saying that the one that I just read to you is a bad interpretation. It's actually a fine interpretation. But I think there are just a couple of things I want to mention as we go along that will help you see some of the differences, in my view, from the view of the interpreters of this section. And so as we look at some of the hardest Hebrew in the Song of Solomon, let's take a look. First we see in verses 4 and in verse 5, we see Solomon once again connecting with his bride as he did on his wedding night. They are finally rekindling that romance and that passion that they once had for one another, and the dream sequence, the problem that they had is now passing away, and finally they are focused on one another again. And there's no more apathy, there's no more insecurity and those types of things. They're now moving back into that same passion that they had on their wedding night. And so Solomon reminds Shulamith of that night with what he says in verses 5 and 6 and even through 7. You'll notice here, if you compare verses 5 through 7 to Song of Solomon chapter 4, you will find that there's very similar language. And there are a few changes, but for the most part, it's the same. He starts with her eyes, and he tells her that he can't look at her anymore because she's looking at him almost seductively. And this is not a problem for a married couple. I want you to understand. A married couple can flirt with one another and look seductively at one another because it's not lust, it's love, it's marriage. And it's part of their love for one another together. It's only lust whenever it's inappropriate, when it's not within the bounds of marriage. And so as we look at this, Solomon just can't take her beauty. He can't handle her. She's too beautiful for him. And it starts with the eyes that are darting back and forth as she begins to, in a way, really arouse him to desire her yet again. And we remember that the night before he had left her just kind of there, in search for a place to go, because that's really what he was looking for. In verses 6 and 7, we see the same types of things that we saw originally. Now, I want to say this. There are a couple of things that are absent from this part of the poetry, and it is things like her lips, her mouth, and her breasts. He does not mention those three things. Those are the more sensuous, the more sexually charged parts of Shulamith's body for him. And I think that tells us something about Solomon. I think it tells us that Solomon, in his rekindling of her passion and his own passion, in his reconciling of their differences earlier in chapter 5, I think Solomon is attempting to show her that he's in love with her, not her body, and not sex with her. I think it's important for us to understand that sex is not the center of a marriage. It is part of a marriage. It's a very important part of a marriage, and it's something that you can use to monitor how your marriage is going. But the marriage in the Song of Solomon is not about sex and physical attraction. It's about character attraction and reconciliation and being friends at the deepest core level of a person. And that causes things like intimacy with one another. And so this is what we see. Solomon most likely omits those things that are more sensuous because he wants her to understand that he loves her for her. And if they have sex, great. If not, he still loves her for who she is, even without the sex. He tells us that there are 60 queens and 80 concubines and virgins without number. And then he contrasts her in verses 9 and 10 with those in verse 8. Solomon, throughout the book, has always seen her as the only woman for him. He isn't looking around. He does not care about other women. He is looking only at her, and he reiterates that several times throughout the book. This is another one of those times. Now, he's referring to queens and to concubines and to the virgins, or the young women in the king's harem. Now, these three groups of women are surely going to be found in the temple. The queens would have been women that were married to the king, but more legally than for love. It was more of a, the princesses of these kings that he had to deal with in other lands. So it's not necessarily understood, although Solomon had many wives and many concubines, it's not for certain that every single one of those women was a true, intimate marriage as much as it was a political move for most of them. Concubines would have been women that worked for the palace. They could have been used by a king for sexual pleasure. in certain cultures, but they could also have been used in social situations. And that's probably what they were like in Israel, although we can't guarantee that the Israeli kings were always righteous and honorable in the way that they used the women in the courts. And then the final one is the virgins, the young women in the harem. And these were women who would have attended to the needs in the palace. They would have been just young women that were beautiful and would have been kept in the palace more for show than anything else, really. And so these are the three types of women that Shulamith is very familiar with, because she now lives in the palace with Solomon. And he says, all of them, there are many women, but you are the only one. You are unique. And this is what he tells Shulamith. And this is the language he uses when he calls her my dove, my perfect one, the only one of her mother. This doesn't mean that her mother didn't have other children. It's pointing out her onlyness, her uniqueness to Solomon, her importance to him. When he looks in a room crowded with women, he sees one woman, and that's Shulamith. And as he continues, he tells her that, look, I'm not the only one who sees you as the most beautiful woman. The queens, the concubines, the virgins, everyone's talking about you because you are so beautiful. And so here we have a quote in verse 10. Who is this who looks down like the dawn, beautiful as the moon, bright as the sun, awesome as an army with banners? They're referring to Shulamith. They're talking about her. And she's the talk of the palace, not some other woman. Solomon is only concerned with her, and she is the popular one. She is the one that everyone is talking about. And I just want to point out a textual issue, and that is in verses 4 and 11. We have this awesome as an army with banners. While Solomon compared Shulamith to the cities of Tirzah and Jerusalem, these beautiful, beautiful Israeli cities, that third line in verse 4 says something to the effect of, you are like an army with its banners. And the Hebrew there is strange, and it's not actually used exactly like in verses 4 and 11 ever again. But the closest thing we have is in like Habakkuk or something. And it's not really that close of one. Scholars will stretch it. The suggestion is that he's either dealing with the idea that she is terribly beautiful. Her beauty is actually terrifying, how beautiful this woman is. Like an army that's terrifying. Or, the second option, which is maybe more likely, is that he's simply referring back to these two beautiful cities as he's talking about this beautiful woman and lumping her in with other beautiful structures, other beautiful things. And so the suggestion there is that these women in the court are doing the same thing. They're saying, you are more beautiful than the sun, the moon, the stars, than anything else. You are the most beautiful among women. And so that's probably what's going on. In verses 11 and 12, we have something very interesting here. In most translations that I've looked at, it says that the woman is talking. However, a lot of the commentaries that I'm looking at suggest that the man is speaking here. One of the things is that so far the man has been speaking. So if it switches to the woman, it switches for like a verse. In verses 11 and 12, switches for like 2 verses. And then it's right back to the man for chapter 7 after the others speak. And so it seems kind of cumbersome that she would say something just in between there when it's more possible that it's the man. And let me show you why I believe that. In verses 11 and 12 he says, I went down to the nut orchard to look at the blossoms of the valley, to see whether the vines have budded, whether the pomegranates were in blossom. Before I was aware, my desire set me among the chariots of my kinsman, a prince. If it's the woman speaking, this idea of before I was aware, and my desire set me before me among the chariots of my kinsman a prince. If it's the woman speaking, she's referring to Solomon as sort of, in her mind's eye, just appearing before her again. If it's Solomon speaking, though, he is telling Shulamith that even though she was this poverty-stricken peasant, she is now more precious, more beautiful, more noble than any prince, than anyone else in any royal kingdom or royal palace or royal family. And so it's my suggestion, because of verses 11 and 12, that it's the man speaking, it's Solomon continuing his speech, that there is no change in voice here. He also refers to the nut orchard, to the blossoms of the valley, to the vines that have budded, and throughout the book, gardens and agricultural images have always referred to Shulamith. So Shulamith would not speak of herself this way. It's Solomon who speaks of her in the senses of gardens and agricultural terms. It's my suggestion that this is Solomon speaking. Then the others chime in. They say, "Return, return, O Shulamite. Return, return, that we may look upon you." Now, this is very short what they say. The word here for return is the word shuv in Hebrew, and it can mean to return or to continue. Now, it's obvious from verse 13 and from 7:1 through 10 or so that Shulamith is dancing before Solomon. And so the suggestion here by many commentators is that the others, which may not just be the women now, might include men, are asking Shulamith to continue to dance the way she's dancing. Now the dance that's referenced here in the end of verse 13 is, it says, as upon a dance before two armies. Hebrew word there is very interesting because it may not be a dance between two armies. It may be a type of dance. Kind of like, there's salsa, that's a kind of dance. There's ballroom dancing, that's a kind of dance. And then there's this Hebrew word for dance that may be a certain kind of dance, and quite honestly, it might be a very sensual dance, a dance that's meant for a husband to enjoy. And so the suggestion here by many commentators is that the others want to watch also. And this is what I think is true about the book. Solomon responds to the others and he says, "Why should you look upon the Shulamite as upon a dance before two armies?" He's saying, why should you look upon my wife, Shulamith, while she is dancing for me? This is for me, this is not for you. And it brings back a recurring theme in the Song of Solomon, if I'm right, and that is the privacy of a couple, the privacy of a husband and his wife in their own bedchambers. They close themselves off to the rest of the public. This is not for everyone else to see. This is for Solomon. This is for Shulamith. I want to end by just mentioning that Shulamite here is mentioned twice, which is where we generally get the name Shulamith from as we talk about this woman. She may have a completely other name. However, in the book of the Song of Solomon, some have suggested that she's from a place called Shulam or Shunem. There is a place in the New Testament named Shulam. And so some have suggested that she is named after the place that she comes from. Another suggestion, and this is a little bit more technical, is that her name is actually the counterpart in the dictionary for Solomon's name. Solomon and Shulamith come from the same root in Hebrew, a word that you would know very well. It's shalom. And so Solomon, it sounds different in Hebrew. It sounds like Sholomon. So there's the shalom in there. And then you've got Shulamith. There's the shalom in there. And so the suggestion is that these are two, the feminine and the masculine counterparts of the word for peace and perfection and wholeness and completeness. And so that may be the reason her name is Shulamith by the writer of the Song of Solomon. At any rate, this brings the two back together again in this garden that Solomon has fled to after his wife rejected him. She goes, she finds him. He doesn't treat her wrongly because she wouldn't have sex with him earlier whenever he was passionate for her and she wasn't passionate for him. he lets it go. He reminds her of how beautiful she is, and their love is rekindled based on their reconciliation and their character for one another. And so this is a beautiful, beautiful song that teaches us that it's not about sex, and sex doesn't necessarily fix a marriage. What fixes a marriage is whenever there's reconciliation between two close and deeply relational friends. I hope this helps you today to understand a little bit more about marriage and to be able to use it in your marriage. I hope you have a blessed day.